Today on Resource Talks, I'm wearing plaid because we're saving Canada, or at least saving Canadian mining this time for real. When I say we are saving Canadian mining, I mostly mean Stephen Stewart, who's the chairman of the OR Group and a Young Mining Professional Scholarship Fund, is at least attempting to save Canada by, well, by the looks of it, by writing letters to Canadian officials. So we'll talk about that, including the Prime Minister multiple times. As always, this is going to be a long, in-depth conversation, so feel free to use the timestamps provided in the description and on the time bar to better navigate the video. And if you want just a quick 10-minute summary of this conversation, go to resourcetalks.com for the written version of this and all of our previous interviews, as well as consider subscribing to our free email list, which sends a weekly summary to your inbox with all the interviews from the prior week in bullet point summaries. And before all that, though, I'd like to warn you that we have received monetary compensation from the OR Group for the production of this video. Please understand that this channel is a business that sells content producing services to companies, which means you cannot rely on this video for research and you should treat this as an advertisement instead. In addition, the guest and I have aligned business interests in multiple ways. I am personally invested in multiple of the OR Group affiliated companies, and Stephen has a non-arm's length relationship with Resource Talks. While the guest does not influence editorial decisions, this relationship still represents a potential conflict of interest, which is why viewers and listeners should always conduct their own due diligence. Due diligence is conducted by reading company official filings, which you can find on setterplus.ca. And please only proceed if you know what you're doing. This interview is intended only for experienced junior mining speculators because mineral exploration, development, and mining is a very tough business where failure is the norm and should be the expectation. This is going to be a conversation that is general and impersonal in nature, containing forward-looking statements. I am not a licensed financial advisor, so before continuing on, please talk to an investment advisor with a good long-term track record because your capital is at risk, and I am not a financial advisor, and I do not have a good long-term track record. If you're not 100% sure you understand 100% of the disclaimers I just showed you, please go to the last section of this video and do not consume this content unless you fully understand and agree with everything said therein. That all said, Stephen, you start off and I quote, Canada can be the richest nation in the world, not just in wealth, but in sustainability, respect, and productivity. Our incredible mineral endowment, ingrained expertise tuned to extraction, and world-class infrastructure combined with our unique geography, where vast and sparsely inhabited lands abound, present an unparalleled chance. We have all the parts, we just need to organize, innovate, and execute. It goes on, if we can establish ourselves as the global destination for mining, investment, exploration, development, and extraction, we could achieve unmatched prosperity on a per capita basis. So first of all, this sounds like the intro of a political campaign. So maybe that's something you want to do later on. But isn't this a bit of a coulda, shoulda, woulda situation? Like, is there objectively still hope for Canada as a mining jurisdiction?
Well, absolutely. We have an incredible opportunity to regain. I mean, we were once the leader in call it mineral extraction, natural resource extraction, and I include within that the capital markets and all the expertise that falls within that purview, whether it's entrepreneurs, lawyers, capital markets exec, financiers, but of course geologists, engineers. We have all that intellectual property. We have all of the natural blessings in they call it the resource endowments. We have low density. We're a wealthy nation, relatively speaking. So we've been there. We've just drifted. I think lots of things have drifted, but that's a conversation for another time. But we've drifted away from, I think, focused on productivity, core values, allowed too many people into the kitchen, too many cooks. And I think the world has taken note. They're taking the opportunity. And I think I'm hopeful. Okay. I'm always an optimist. In the junior mining business, you have to be an optimist. So I do think we're going to regain. I do hear the winds changing in terms of what politicians are saying. Talk is cheap, and I don't believe anything they say, but at least they're saying the right things. I'm more interested in action. But look, we will regain it. Okay. That's how I feel about it, but it's going to take some time. It's going to take a complete 180 in terms of how we've handled certain things. And if you've taken the time to read my little manifesto there, which is long-winded, as I tend to be sometimes, it talks about permitting being our number one risk, which is associated with the West, and Canada is no exception there. So that's where I think if we could get those timeframes down to what they used to be like, multi-decades ago, you could find hemlo and put it production in a couple of years. If we could get back to that, we'd be in business. Now, one could argue that the consultation process with various local communities and even more the environmental considerations. 50 years ago, the environment wasn't even a word. So things have changed. And we view development and who gets a share of them differently. Fine. But we've learned a lot. We understand those processes. So it's really more about the elimination of bureaucracy, the consolidation of the regime, and a recognition at the authority level of how important we are to not just the national economy, but the local economies and jobs and economic prosperity, but also our way of life. So that trickles down to how the mining industry is perceived in the general public. I have said on your show, I'm quite certain, because give me a microphone and I'll talk about it, how I think we're just mischaracterized as the bad guy in the media and online and in the masses. If you're not in the weeds in this industry, you probably look upon it quite negatively. So there really has to be a total change in how we position ourselves as positive, as purveyors of high quality of life and economic activity. And look, we've got a lot of answers in our industry. So, and as I said, I tend to be long-winded. That was a long-winded answer, but I hope I answered your question.
Well, you note a couple of points here, or multiple points. I think about 10 or something. I'll instead of having you recite them, I'll post them in the pinned comment under this video so people can read those if they want to, and also comment on and say whatever you think Stephen's right or wrong on. Has anyone answered any of those emails or letters, Stephen, that you've sent?
No,
no one?
nobody. I've sent them to premiers, prime ministers, past and present. I have been invited in to talk, not necessarily as a result of my efforts, but just sort of, I guess, somebody may view me as a person in the industry. So I have been invited to speak. And I guess actually when I was invited to not speak, but also listen and be participants in roundtables, et cetera. And that really was the genesis of why I wrote this. I mean, because I thought that they weren't listening or weren't, not that they weren't listening, but this is not what they do day in and day out. And so they need to hear from those who live and breathe this, what the real challenges are, what our perspective is. So that was the genesis of this, going back a year or two. You talked about Save Canadian Mining. I mean, I have been queried on that on a number of fronts, officially and unofficially. And I'm happy to talk about it, but I think, that's a bold, I'm supportive, all else equal. Saves Canadian Mining. I think there's deeper issues than just the uptick rule and shorting, which are probably problems, but that's not why we're at where we are.
That's an interesting point. So you bring up an interesting point right there. Why are we where we are? I mean, it makes me think, if it is the government's fault and the government's job to solve it in the first place, or is it our own fault as an industry and our job to solve it? And especially the financial / market side of it, if you will. I mean, don't you think a lot of these problems that we have, and we'll talk about them hopefully later on, but don't you think a lot of them would disappear if the financial side of the natural resource space sector cleaned up its act first? Like we're dealing with founder shares and royalties and warrants and 4-month holds and charity flow through and not helping for financings and 50% advertising spends. And I mean, the list of things that, to me at least, as a newcomer, seem weird from the outside looking in, it keeps going. And so why not start there? Why don't we fix it instead of having to ask the government to do it for us and potentially introducing more regulations?
Well, I don't think a lot of the things you mentioned necessarily help. But I don't think they're the core issue of the problem, because founder shares isn't why we are where we're at. That's not the perceived risk of investment in Canada, because those very same founders can do it in West Africa, or other jurisdictions. So those issues you cite are not specific to Canada. They're specific to the industry, and wherever your opinion falls on it. Yeah, I mean, there's no question there are shenanigans, let's just call it that, in the industry, which I'm all for, in favor of tightening up. I am just naturally inclined to be cautious of what new regulation is going to come in to fix old problems. I'm more of a free market individual. You had referenced in the past earlier to saying, talking about warrants. The Australians don't do warrants by and large. There's exceptions to the rule. And should we ban warrants? Well, no, I don't want to ban anything. If a commercial transaction between two willing parties includes warrants, well, that's up to them. I don't really want any government body coming in here to tell me that we can't do that. So, as a corporation, as an issuer of shares or units of shares which may include warrants, I obviously don't want to include warrants, right? It's a function of pricing. So, I mean, it's just how a deal is priced. As an investor, I love warrants. All else equal. So there's lots of considerations there, but I mean, so let me back up and say, look, I am all in favor of us enforcing the laws and everybody acting in accordance with securities law and best practices, etc. But fundamentally, those issues, which are not unique to the mining industry, there are shenanigans and even fraud in every industry. And those are not specific to the mining industry, nor is it the reason why we need to really save Canadian mining.
Again, I'm not suggesting necessarily more. I'm actually wary of more regulations as well. I'm thinking more like, shouldn't we as a culture try to improve on these things? I mean, and even we can probably make a whole podcast on warrants, because I am not in support of warrants at all. Even as an investor, I would rather the company I invest in not do warrants at all, not to me, not to anyone else. But I mean, isn't there anything else to be done before we start looking for a solution on the regulatory level? Can it not be a culture shift? Am I being naive in believing that might happen, or how do you see that?
Now, again, I'll just repeat my situation. Like, I don't think all of the things that you're talking about, founders, shares, warrants, are inherently the problem with the industry. The biggest problem with the industry, which extends over a period of now 12, 13 years, is the macro headwinds we've faced, right? I mean, which have changed certainly now, although I guess the trajectory of the juniors remains the same, and I think we can talk about those reasons.
Well, let's maybe take it step by step then in that case. I mean, I think a large part of what you've written is about fixing the regulatory environment, and again, there's some points that we can talk about later on, but maybe start off high level. What specifically is broken right now? I mean, if you don't believe it's warrants or the misuse of founder shares or whatever, what is broken on a regulatory level? What is there to be fixed?
Well, fundamentally, again, it goes back to permitting. I think that is the number one risk associated with investment flowing into our country and being able to operate. That has to do with the number of permits associated with getting a drill permit and ultimately operating a mine. I mean, I haven't ever counted how many there are, but let's just say there are hundreds of individual permits required to build a mine, from discovery all the way to production. There are many governmental bodies one needs to communicate and liaise with over that period, whether it's First Nations, municipal, provincial, federal, etc. And those departments aren't always talking to each other, and so it's just inefficient. And we have been listening, and I also said it off the top, but there's just too many. Well, that's a good example. There's too many cooks in that kitchen, and it just one thing goes to one department and they approve it, and then they have to seek somebody else's approval, and it sits on their desk, and they make a change, it goes back, and again, ultimately, the bureaucrats, if you will, and with all due respect to the bureaucrats, they're hardworking people for the most part. They're also not incented to move it through. In fact, they're probably disincented to move things through because of concern about environmentalism. There's no upside. There's really only downside from them being expeditious and moving things forward. So they're extra cautious, too cautious. Again, I emphasize, I'm not advocating that we eliminate or even reduce our environmental or community considerations. I think those are important parts, and that's how we do good business. It's an important, but I just think we can do those things much faster, much quicker, harmoniously between the government. I hope there is discussion. Again, it's just discussion around creating one entity. I'm not sure how that will unfold, but one entity is certainly a step in the right direction. Beyond that, I think the overlying issue in Canada and in fact around the world is how local communities, certainly the First Nations, would be the most prevalent factor in that. But it's not just the First Nations, it's anybody proximate in their communities. So mining is an impactful business. There's no question about it, just like anything, I suppose. My position, if done correctly, and there's no other way to do it these days, that it's net communities can benefit. Now, that's not speaking for anybody, but so anyway, I guess as I digress, I think we need a solution for, let's just say, be specific. We need a solution for the First Nations, which I will admit is very challenging. There are hundreds of individual First Nations, each with their own leadership structure, wants, needs, viewpoints. And then within each community, there's, either, dozens to hundreds of or thousands of individuals within them. So it is very difficult to solve this problem. So I'm not diminishing the challenge, although I am saying you're never going to please everybody. We do need to make collective decisions on how we move these things forward for the collective. We cannot stop what is best for the majority because of the super minority. I think the minorities, whatever, if it's 0.001% or 49.9, I think everybody deserves the right to be heard. We do have these consultation processes. I think, let's talk about the consultation process in the Ring of Fire, something in Northern Ontario, something I used to follow quite closely. It's been going on for decades, and there's still and I would suggest that there has been ample opportunity for consultation, although there are those still saying they haven't been consulted. I'm not so, I think at some point in time, you can't just default to I haven't been consulted. It's sometimes they just haven't gotten what they want. And who has the ultimate definitive right to say, I have a say? Nobody asked me, and so where is that line drawn? So I think that's a big challenge to overcome, but we do need to build a coalition of the willing while being sensitive to everybody that allows us to continue to develop Canada and North America as it has been developed for the past 100+ years, about building infrastructure, focusing on productivity, mining and industrial capabilities and economic development. Somewhere along the line, all that is somehow deemed wrong, and I just fundamentally disagree with that. I'm very much pro development. I think right now, more than any point in the history of time, we are better than we've ever been at anything. You're lucky to be alive now relative to 100 or 200 or 1,000 years old, where you have certainly here in Canada a level of safety, security, comfort, surety on the future. You are rewarded for your hard work. You have the opportunity for healthcare, education, etc. All those things come from the things we're trying to do in the mining industry and in an industry as a whole. But there is this broader movement to characterize that as somehow negative, or other words that are being used to somehow allow those who have been successful to feel guilty about the progress that Canada and other nations like it have had. So I just sort of disagree with that. And I think we've listened too much to those who take that narrative, and we need to take the narrative back and and move forward. It's always about, like, my mantra is just move forward. And we've been stagnant for too long.
Knowing the type of kid I was, I probably wouldn't be alive if this was 100 years ago. I've been saved by modern medicine multiple times. But well, actually, another way, getting personal. I think about, and this will get us back in talking about on topic here. But when I was a kid, I would blame the teacher. I would be like, oh, the teacher hates me. They tell me, oh, go outside the class, you're talking too much. Like they're just focusing on me. They hate me. And over time, my parents were able to explain to me that you might be the problem. Maybe you talk too much. Maybe you play too much. You don't pay attention. So that's why they don't like you. And so now I'm starting to think about the mining industry and thinking about teams that, there's teams who will go out there and talk about, oh, the permitting process is slow, but there's also teams out there who some companies will still move relatively fast, right? There's teams out there who do get permitting on a timely basis. The majority don't, but some still do. So how do I know it's, again, from the outside looking in, how do I know it's an industry problem versus a team problem?
That's a very, very fair comment. There are definitely team issues, people issues. I've advocated many times that the single most important thing in the junior mining industry, or frankly, any small business, is the individuals behind it. Are they aligned? Do they really want to move it forward? Can they? So yeah, like, the individuals are certainly something you need to consider. And I can't, that's not something I can really have a further opinion on it. The second aspect is the project. Some projects are challenging, more challenging to permit than others. So there's that factor. And then there is the regime, which I've spoken about long-windedly, and that change is absolutely necessary to avoid 30-year discovery to production situations, which is absurd and counterproductive and contrary to the interests of the country and its people. But yeah, look, there's all sorts in this industry, as we alluded to, with how certain people act on the capital markets fronts, and perhaps being too overzealous and granting them this or that. And then there are those that are just happy to sit back and wait and finance $500,000, $1 million a year, and just they're living a good life, and goes nowhere, and they can oftentimes just hide in the fray because, let's face it, 90%, probably more. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but you have to succeed in this industry, and to succeed as a project, you have to beat the odds overwhelmingly. So it's if I can call the projects and the companies that don't succeed losers, which I think is an unfair moniker, it's easy to hide within them, because even the good guys and the good projects are going to fail. So if you fail with a bad project and a bad attitude, you can sort of say, hey, well, look, everybody does it. So it's easy to hide, and that's why I think it's, again, so important to focus on those who do succeed and do acquire good projects and do achieve milestones and do what they say they're going to do, or give their best efforts towards something like we certainly aspire to do. I don't always do it as quickly as I had forecasted 1, 2, 3 years ago, or whatever it may be. Things often take twice as long as I want, but it's relatively easy. You're in this business long enough, and there is certainly transparency, whether it's the online, let's just call it the online community, to call individuals out. So with a little bit of research, you can get a good feel for who the executives are, and if you can't find anything about them online, whether it's on Twitter or any chat boards or anything else, it's, exercise a strong degree of caution.
So again, I'm personally, just this is a personal belief, maybe based on naivete or being inexperienced, but I believe markets should be as open as possible. But at the same time, I also cannot help but think, especially in the back of what's happened in Turkey, but also with Victoria and whatnot, and stuff like that happen all the time. I'm thinking about, if a company cannot navigate a complex and a burdensome permitting process or permitting system as a whole, do they really should they really be in the business of operating 30-year mega projects in the first place? Then those two things go together, like hand in hand. Like if you can deal with the complexity of the permitting process, maybe that also says something about your competency as an operator of complex systems, if that makes sense.
Sure. Again, that falls back to people experience and their
Hmm.
ability to have capital, because you do require capital, which lends itself to expertise. You can hire expertise to navigate these channels. Depends on which segment you're talking about. If you're talking about building a mine, obviously, yeah, you need to have the skill set in place and the capital available to navigate the highly complex, call it the multi-hundred permit situation. So, I don't think that's an excuse. I don't think that any serious company looking to build a mine, they need to be properly advised. And if they don't have the expertise, well, look, that happens.
Hmm.
That doesn't negate the fact that the regime itself isn't excessively and overly complicated, and the various authorities within that are either not motivated or and probably oftentimes disincented to be efficient, make decisions. There's fear of decision. It's easy to leave something on your desk and be ambiguity about it. They're taking a risk by making a decision and putting themselves out there that could offend a special interest group, whoever that may be. So unfortunately, the regimes are just not incented to push things through. I think these people make a comfortable six-figure existences, whether our project goes through or not.
Hmm. And on the company side, that's existent too. I've experienced it personally in the uranium space where, I don't necessarily want to throw anybody under the bus, but a company would hide behind, oh, it's just taking too long, the permitting is taking too long. But we don't really, as retail investors, we don't get much transparency into the process. We don't see the email exchange, I suppose, between the company and the government. Are they really pushing, or were they, on vacation that given week? So, would you be in support of kind of full public transparency of permitting timelines and communication logs, like where it gets published in a newspaper or in a government facility or something like that? That's something you'd be in support
Well,
of?
the answer is it depends. But look, I don't have full transparency on it. That's wonderful, Antonio. That's what I'm championing for. Get rid of the black box of what is permitting. Right?
Hmm.
Tell us exactly what it is. I mean, if you can find me, I mean, I haven't looked, but if there is a single source on the web, say, how do I permit a mine from A to Z? And a form. I think that would be wonderful. Let's start
Hmm.
there. Let's go back to first principles, but it doesn't exist.
Hmm.
And so it is a black box, and it's a black box on top of a black box, because there are, as I said before, there's multiple channels who are responsible of the respected boxes. And so it's a bloody quagmire is what it is. It's a disaster. And nobody knows really what's going on. And then overlaying, you've got the First Nations who are have their own set of rules that don't jive with those of the government. There is this level of distrust between, and justifiably so, between government, First Nations, and industry, and everybody's skeptical of everybody. So there is, and people are oftentimes afraid to communicate freely, and oftentimes, and let's just going back to First Nations, which I think is a huge issue that needs to be resolved, is there are different types of First Nations and approaches, and some of them have very clear. There are those who are very sophisticated, have very clear protocol, and will communicate that. And there are those who don't have that, which makes the process more difficult. And I understand that, but I'm just sort of vocalizing. These are some of the things that exploration and mining companies have to manage on top of the province, and sometimes phone calls are just not returned, and so these do lead to lengthy, often unnecessary, but certainly lengthy delays that investors get frustrated with, which is extrapolated in the perception, if not the reality, that Canada is not an overly friendly place to permit and hence invest. These investors, especially sophisticated ones, plug these things into their NPVs and their IRRs on their little Excel spreadsheets. And if you take a 3-year time frame and you put it over 30, the numbers don't look good. So they go elsewhere. So capital flows to the path of least resistance. Canada has been in a path of resistance. We have shut the door to other, that's another thing that needs clarity, is, are we accepting Chinese money or other government money that we deem to be unfriendly or not? Are our projects national sovereignty, security issues. There's lots of ambiguity there. I can cite many examples. If we go back to multi-decades, there's lots of people who are upset that Noranda and Falconbridge got sold to foreign entities, and so there is that. I mean, to me, I'm very much for free market. So if anybody who is not a direct enemy of ours wants to come in and invest, wonderful. I'm also at the same time very much in favor of Canada securing the supply of its own metals, because that's how we build and defend ourselves, which is critical. So, and how do you manage those two things, which on the surface are counter positions? But to me, it's about having Canada incent investment, domestic investment in domestic assets. There have been talks. I mean, I think the Conservative government, as part of their election promises, which obviously didn't work out, but they were talking about giving tax-free capital gains if you reinvest it into Canada. I thought that was a good idea. I'd never thought of that one, but that's somehow a way where the retail community could call it patriotically invest in Canada in tax incentivized ways. I think there is definitely something to be said for sovereign wealth funds, which to my knowledge, Canada doesn't have one. We have pension funds, which are answerable to their pensioners, and so they have to compete. So they're not. And there's been talk around very sophisticated billionaires in this country incenting, asking CPPIB to invest in Canada. CPPIB can't take discounts or take higher risks than they otherwise would. Otherwise, the pensioners are being short. So that's a tricky issue, but I do think that Canada needs to compete or have a competitive fund, if you will. I think that was one of my points in my little letter, was have a sovereign metals fund or sovereign investment fund that has the nation as a beneficiary, not individual pension. So that would disconnect fiduciary, I think, and they would have a different approach, okay? Because I've advocated, and many others have, and I used to be an analyst in my former life, involved in chasing basis points and NPVs, and mining companies and long-lived assets are valued disfavorably when you apply the traditional finance methodologies, because after year 15 or whatnot, whatever it may be, depending on various inputs, the terminal value becomes zero, right? But the tier one mines can be multi-generational. It doesn't mean they're worth zero past year 17, but that's how your spreadsheet values them. So we need to have, and that's how China values them. So China's after the metal. They're not financial investors. They're product investors. So I think it would behoove Canada to take some of its wealth wherever it's generated out of. Hopefully, we should have been collecting our big gains out of our oil, which has been a huge benefit to Canada, because unfortunately oil is not going anywhere anytime soon. So I think we need to take a realistic approach about that, benefit from it, build the infrastructure so that the United States is not our only customer who discounts it heavily, and put all those taxes and royalties gained off that into a fund that reinvests into the next generation economy, which includes, if not is predominantly led by, call it, what do they call them? Electric metals, critical metals, all the metals, they're all critical in my opinion. So, and do so on a nationalistic basis where we can compete with the state-owned enterprises of China who compete. I don't want to say compete unfairly, but their rules are very different than ours, and hence we just can't compete. And we see that time and time again, why China has basically tied up a huge portion of Africa. They came for our assets here. We're keeping them out. Now they're going down to South America. So I really do think that we need to be open, have free capital markets, but also creative ways, new ways to incent retail and call it sovereign investment in our assets, and of course our infrastructure.
Well, if you don't like your oil being discounted, can I interest you in becoming the 51st state? You said go ahead.
I'm very comfortable being independent and sovereign. I don't think that's a real proposal. I think that's bluster and political positioning. And I do think that, and I just said this yesterday, is that I think Trump is shooting for the stars and hoping he'll end up on the moon. And so what I mean by, that's kind of like you read his book, and that's sort of what he does. He starts big, and then they'll settle there, and they say it's the best deal ever. So I think the ultimate objective is for there to be, a new deal, not to quote Roosevelt there, but a new way to approach trade and economic cooperation on this continent, and I'd be all in favor of that.
That might be a podcast in and of itself, and I'm definitely undergunned for it. But you said a lot there. There's loads to touch upon. I do want to talk about foreign investment because I think you've trying to dip your toe in that water. I think you went to the Middle East not too long ago to see how that is. So we can talk about that. But something else you said
I have
before.
been in all four corners of the globe. I have trotted around looking for capital at some point in my career, Antonio. But yes, most recently I did go to the Middle East because I do think that clearly they've indicated interest in investment in the hard metal space as they look to diversify away from much as Canada needs to do. I just think they're being much more proactive about it.
I do have a question about that, and we'll get to it. But if we don't talk about that other thing that I want to talk about, we'll forget it because we started off by talking about the First Nations, and I wonder if the current permitting framework gives the First Nations enough power, too much power, or not enough power. And I was trying to find it. I think I read it on Twitter, LinkedIn. I cannot find it right now. If I find it, I'll put it up on the screen. But it was someone saying, First Nations and the and I'm paraphrasing here, so give me some rope. But First Nations and the amount of power that they get now is not a problem. It's just that they were underrepresented before, and now they're fairly represented. And sure, the delta is large, but on an absolute basis, they don't get too much power. Do you feel like that's the case, and do you feel like this is the new baseline and the new normal that we have to work with?
Unquestionably, historically, and I don't know what that time frame is, it's very gray. Historically, they have been not treated fairly. I think that's in terms of mineral resource participation and legacy issues. And it's not unique to the First Nations. It's just local communities. It was the owners of the mine that come in there, they take it out, they leave the waste. The waste isn't properly treated, and they're gone. And the corporation, declares bankruptcy, and there's nobody to go after. Obviously, the system has completely changed where now there's pre-funded closure plans that need to be bonded and put in place. So I think that's noteworthy. I definitely think the First Nations, and again, I'm not singling First Nations out, all local communities need to be beneficiaries of the wealth that is generated from the land around them. I think that's only reasonable. I think they all deserve a seat at the table. I think everybody needs to be heard, but then I think there needs to be consensus. And so how it's all the pie is split and who gets what say and who and for how long. I mean, there has to be an end. There has to be a defined process. That's fundamental. Investment doesn't like uncertainty. So I advocate for clarity and seats at the table based on scientific, hard measures, metrics, whatever you want to call it, and a clear cash flow waterfall of who gets what. And I want that to be totally transparent. And I want the government to deal with the First Nations because on that issue, because it's too often offloaded onto small juniors. It is the province's respective responsibility to duty to consult, but that is offloaded. Okay. And so that is, even though it is the provinces, oftentimes First Nations don't agree with the process, don't agree with the provincial laws. And so the companies are in situations where they have to abide by the provincial laws, get certain permits, okay, and then there is permission. And so that is very difficult to coalesce and deal with. So you can be fully permitted, but without permission, you can't move, or one could take the position you can't move. And so there is this constant threat of a veto from any one particular group, which is problematic. And so we need to eliminate ambiguous or ill-defined vetoes and make them and give clarity so that everybody understands exactly what you need to do. And if it doesn't work out, well, there's no project and everybody walks away. But this perpetual ambiguity is a problem.
What does partnership with First Nations look like in your perfect world? I mean, is it giving them equity, revenue sharing? Do they help you run the project? Is it an MOU? Like there's many multiple ways, I suppose, not many, maybe not many, but multiple ways. And so yeah, what does it look like?
Well, every situation is unique. Every First Nation has different wants and needs and levels of ambition to be involved. Some don't want to be involved. Some want to be and very much involved. But I mean, fundamentally, it starts off with communication and transparency. As I think, if you want to do good business, you have to introduce yourself, go up there, meet in person, explain what your intentions are, and have a dialogue. I mean, it starts there, and then you understand what the wants and needs are, and you're communicating with a First Nations just like you would with the government. And when I say the government, I mean the provincial, the federal. And again, oftentimes, that situation is very unique because sometimes you're dealing with various different ministries. So I mean, I could go on and on, but I mean, it's transparency, it's communication, it's acting with good faith, it's following through, offering opportunities that are mutually beneficial, and seeing where it goes. But if you are, and again, there's also a bifurcation between an exploration program and building a mine. For an exploration program, there's only so much, aside from the things, the tenets that I talked about, communication, transparency, etc. There's only so much that a small exploration company can afford to give on very high risk, very expensive projects, and a company that's ill-financed 9 times out of 10 call it away to various initiatives. That money needs to go into the ground to understand if there is a pie to be split. So that is something I'm quite firm on, is that I do think that exploration companies need to be treated very differently from those companies that have clearly defined economic ore bodies that are going to be progressed towards a mine. And so there actually is going to be cash flow. And then once you've determined that, then, I think that, jobs, royalties, taxes, money for infrastructure, all needs to be part of the pie. And again, every mine is different. You have Oyo Tolgoi, you can build a hospital. You have a marginal mine in the middle of nowhere. Well, you probably, you tag on the hospital requirement, the project goes belly up real fast. So I think that's something that everybody, all stakeholders need to understand, is that this is a capitalist system we're working within, and if the capital requirements become too burdensome, money flows elsewhere, and that project becomes uneconomic, and nobody gets anything. So it's a fine line, and every situation is different. So look, I'm not unsympathetic to the situation that we've found ourselves in, which is, as I said, a bit of a quagmire. But I do think we need to go. Let's tear up the rule book, bring everybody together, which is probably a naive situation to say, but we need to go back to first principles, figure out what works for everybody in a modern context, and design a completely new system that is pro-development and pro those who are impacted being benefited. All the while incenting and rewarding those who take the capital risk. Capital needs to be rewarded. Otherwise, there is no project.
Based on what you told me about your views on the free market, and also which I would agree with, again, I can kind of infer your answers to the question that I'll try to ask you here. But should there be mandatory First Nations representation on the board level? Like, should they be taking the decisions on necessarily on M&A and capital allocation and what happens, because they know their own regions better? Like, is that something that should be, again, mandated?
Nobody should be mandated on the board. The shareholders are responsible for electing the board. And if the company deems it worthy, and there is an appropriate individual to come on the board, and its shareholders are in agreement, great. Mandated, you're asking for all sorts of problems.
Yeah, Yeah, I agree with that. I think I see, and I've heard podcasts about that, but someone said I'm gonna paraphrase again, but someone said something along the lines of the average mining and exploration board still looks like the 1970s PDAC floor. And I don't know if that's true, and I don't even know if that's necessarily a problem. What they meant, I suppose, is that it's mostly uh, middle-aged white men running these
Yeah,
companies.
it's
Yeah.
true. I mean, I don't know. I haven't looked at it empirically, but yeah, I mean, it is dominated by males, certainly. Their colors of the skin, I don't know. But yeah, I guess it's white guys. And but there's change for sure. There's no question about it. You see lots more women, which is great. I love women. I love different perspectives. You know, I love different, but for me, diversity isn't about checking boxes. It's not about diversity of skin or ethnicity or sex. It's about diversity of perspective and experience that I'm interested in. And so I think that the whole diversity thing is flawed. At least how we're executing it. I think I want diversity in experience and perspective. I want a lawyer, I want an accountant, I want a financier, I want a mining engineer, a geologist, someone who specializes in environmental, someone who specializes in First Nations. Great. All of these things, all these perspectives, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. So that I'm very much in favor of diversity, but just like it just doesn't make sense to um, force companies to check a box. I don't think that serves shareholders. I don't think that serves the project. I think that's just a good idea uh, gone too far.
Hmm. I like how you said you love women. I love women too, and I even married one.
I
Um,
love one woman. Well, a couple, my mother and my wife, and many other women in my family. But yeah, no, I look, what I was trying to say is, look, I was, you know, primarily raised by my mother. Um, my best friend is my wife. I have one daughter. I'm very close with my sisters. I'm all for women in this industry, and I hope even though my daughter is only 4, I am training her to be a treasure hunter. So I'd love for her to follow in my footsteps. But traditionally, let's face it, this business historically wasn't didn't attract women. I still don't think it does on a general basis, a general statement, because we play with trucks and blow things up, and we go underground, and there still is that you know um, I still believe in traditional aspects that men are drawn to certain things and women are drawn to certain things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that said, like lots of women, and to me, it's about the bell curve, right? So it's about percentages, and there is certainly a percentage of women who I deal with, the young mining professionals all the time that are very interested in mining. I think that's fantastic,
hmm.
and I support that.
You you talk about institutional investors. You said you've traveled the world in the seven seas, and you were wanting something from somebody. But I would assume quite often you talk to institutions from all over the place. What are they pushing back on when you talk? And because the org group focuses specifically on Canada, I know you have an investment in Cote d'Ivoire as well. But what are they when you talk to them specifically about Canada? Why don't you have more of them invested in your companies? Essentially, what are they pushing back on?
Well, I don't want to conflate my companies and my challenges with the industry as a whole, but I can just sort of because we have different companies who have different challenges, and investors will have different reasons for wanting or not wanting to invest in those, which isn't indicative of what the challenge Canada faces. I can tell you though, very specifically, and I have traveled the seven seas. I don't know, so to speak, but I've been around, and I love meeting face to face, and I've done it for years and years. And consistently, the number one thing is Canada's too slow in permitting, which is like, I'm not making it up. And if you ask enough people in the know, they say the same thing. I mean, and they can call it, maybe they call it different things, but it's, it just takes too long, is what they say. And maybe some haven't identified that it is, in fact, the permitting. But it is. I mean, fundamentally, we have too many permits that are overlapping and take too long to process. And so you referenced West Africa. Yes, we're in West Africa with Awale, and you knew Awale before I did. And it's been a wonderful ride. And I don't profess to be an expert in Cote d'Ivoire or West Africa or Africa, but certainly it's very clear, and we can look at people in Montage. I mean, look at Montage. Let's talk about them. Uh, Backed by the Lundins and Zijin and some really smart guys. Martino's a young up and coming CEO, comes from Endeavor. Endeavor is another great example. I mean, how many mines did they build in a very short time frame? I can't reference an Endeavor-like company in Canada who's, I don't know how old they are, 10, 15 years old, and they build 4 mines. Doesn't exist. So, that's the attraction, and that's what Martino is trying to do with Montage. And I wish him luck, and I think they'll be successful because they know how to operate within that. If Cote d'Ivoire and West Africa, well, let's just say Cote d'Ivoire more specifically, can keep the stability of its political situation, I think that country is going to do fantastic. And those who know how to operate within it will do so as well, and that'll be reflected in the capital appreciation awards that goes to that risky capital because they can get things done. When I say get things done, they can get to cash flow, right? Whereas here we can't get to cash flow in nearly the same time frames. And so again, beating this horse, it's all about, we are judged on our IRR and NPV, which corresponds to our future cash flows. And if we can't cash flow, why are you investing?
Yeah, that's the ultimate question that we should be answering as an industry. And I think a lot of people from the outside ask those questions, like why, what's that? What is this sector even in the first place? Like junior mining, pre-revenue. Why are these companies not, Silicon Valley style private companies raising their own money and doing it privately, which is also one point on how we might save Canada, I suppose. But do they so they care more about what I'm getting from you here though, is that they care more about the regulatory process than the rocks themselves. Like they ask more about rocks than rules.
Well, certainly, I think it goes without saying we have wonderful rocks. There's no question about it, and but every project has different rocks, and so they will assess the project rocks on their own, and then individually they'll overlay the probability and the timeframes associated with taking rocks and turning it into money. And it takes too long, and that's their general assessment. And they'll say, okay, well, there are comparable rocks, all else equal, in a jurisdiction where I can get it to production in 25% of the time. That's where I'm putting my money. And so if you are a strictly financial investor, where the vast majority of our capital comes from, saving, except sovereign wealth funds will have different approaches. Producing companies will have different approaches, but call it 95% of the capital available to the juniors, certainly early stage junior, they're purely financial investors, and that's how they will be assessing, and that's where the money will flow. As I alluded to before, if you did have a sovereign wealth here in Canada, they would have a different objective. They would be about securing the metal, right? That's a completely different objective. And that's how the Chinese, by and large, operate. And that's also how the producers operate. Barrick or Newmont, whoever the operator is, obviously they are also financial investors, very much so. But fundamentally, their business is about securing supply in pursuit of said financial metrics. And they do have a little bit more leeway because oftentimes their investments in the earlier stages are just rounding errors. So they don't even show up in their NPV calculations unless they get too bold. But so there are differing perspectives, two primary ones on investment in the metals sector, and one is a financial investor, which is you and me, and the other is securing supply. Now, speaking Orr Group's book, while we are financial investors, that's not our approach. It's not about, we don't approach a project, can we make money? Because we're so far removed from the cash flow process. We are derivative on the price of gold. Little more than that. And when I say we, I mean the juniors. And so our philosophy is, can this go into production? Our goal is we want to be a part of a project that will go into production. And we take ownership positions in projects that have that ability. And I think that if we are successful in that, the money will follow. Conversely, if it was just about making money, I don't think that's a sustainable business model. We'd get caught up in the short term. We'd be mining the market as opposed to trying to establish a mine. So that's just a little nuance, something that clicked with me a while ago. It's not meant to be hokey. It's really about having a long-term core philosophy. It's not about the money. It's about the mine. And if we focus on the mine or the ability of the project to become a mine, the money is going to follow. I like the money, don't get me wrong. It's a scorecard, if nothing else, but keeping food on the table. But that's how we approach it. And that does lend to the different categories of financial investor versus those who are interested in security of supply.
Mm. Pieces of paper with pictures on them so we don't kill each ourselves over getting something to eat. I think that's a quote from what is it, Margin Call, I believe. One of the funny things that I remember there, but you're right. No, next point that you've got on here, and I'll try to keep it moving because I know you have, unlike me, you have an actual job that you have to get back to, but talent shortage. How do we fix that? That's one of the biggest challenges to me. I mean, how can mining above the 60th compete against working on AI robots in California? And will talented workforce ever come back to this space?
It's tough. It's been one of our biggest challenges is to attract and retain young people. It's something that's been very close to my heart as I've been a part of the young mining professionals and growing it to a global group. And the scholarship is what it's evolved into, which is where I spend my time and using that as an outlet to attract young people. Something I'd like to grow within the young mining professional is a grassroots education initiative aimed at changing the narrative. In fact, I go to my daughter's kindergarten class and I tell them about mining and how you position it, and as we're treasure hunters and so on and so forth. So I do think we do need to do a better job in changing the narrative. Okay, so that the 12-year-olds and the 16-year-olds want to be in mining, not listening to how we're evil. Call it the misinformation for simplicity's sake. Tell them about how there's wonderful careers you can travel. And we become an important part of the community and economy. And what we produce creates the airplanes that you take to go on your family vacation and so on and so forth. So I do think there's so much there that could be used to leverage a positive narrative, but I think we need to pay attention to it and execute that. I do think that, again, I don't have, and then it's about economies. Okay. So like the past 10 years plus, I mean, tech has been on fire. There's jobs, high paying jobs. They've done very well in terms of financing new codes. That attracts, so money attracts young people who are looking to pay off their very expensive university education. If we go into a boom, which I hope we are on the cusp of going into a sustained multi-year, maybe decade-long boom, that will incent. So really, it's about narrative and providing jobs and opportunity to young people. So I can't control the latter. I think I can have input on the former. I think one of my things is we need to rebrand the mining industry, because the mining industry, just the word mining, conjures up trucks, holes in the ground, and other sort of potentially negative visions to most people who I think it's cool. I love the big yellow trucks, and I love almost everything to do with mining. I'm fascinated. It wasn't always that way, but I've grown to be fascinated. But I do recognize that most don't have that association. So yeah, my thought is to rebrand. Call us the metals industry. Let's just do a subtle change. People positively associate metals because it's a part of our everyday life. It's in everything, right? So like if we can associate ourselves with metals as opposed to a negative, unfortunately, a negative term, mining, I think that would go a long way. Just these little subtle nudges to give a shout out to Malcolm Gladwell, and fellow Canadian, who unfortunately has moved to the US. But anyways, I digress. Little things like that can make a difference. I'll cite the oil and gas industry. I should call them the energy industry, because that's what they call themselves now. Same thing. I stole that idea from them. Oil and gas has all these fossil fuel and negative connotations, often, false, but nonetheless, now they're energy, And so now, even though people still love to hate the energy industry, I think it's a subtle nuance that could be effective, but not on itself is not the solution. Just part of the solution.
Again, there's no one solution, I don't think, either. I mean, everything is part of the solution. Is this realistic, what we've been talking about so far today? Like, do you believe any of this is actually going to happen?
100%. I don't understand why they don't get started. I guess you got to start somewhere. And as you alluded to, and I said, it's not just one thing, it's a whole basket of things. In fact, it's, 11 things if you listen to me, in my little manifesto, and there's many, many more. I certainly don't have all the answers or solutions, far from it. And I'm sure some of them won't work. And that's okay. But I do think we should have a concerted effort to get behind our industry and talk about it positively, and all the benefits it can do. So yeah, I think it's 100% possible. We've just been too complacent. We just think, it's the way it is. And I think that's fundamentally part of our industry's problem, and just the problem at large is that people are just so accepting of the status quo, and it doesn't need to be so. And too often we're reactionary as a result of a problem, or worse, a crisis, and that's where true change comes. But look, our industry is in a mini crisis of sorts. So to me, that presents an opportunity.
What do you think? What are you specifically doing, I suppose, to change? I mean, you say we need to take action, not only talk about it, but take action. I know you're doing stuff with the Young Mining Professional Scholarship Fund and other initiatives. Besides sending letters, I suppose, to the government that don't get answered, what else are you doing to fix it?
Not much else. I got a day job and I got other things to worry about. But I so look, I'm not a bleeding heart. There's only so much I can do, but I do have a positive attitude. I do allocate my time to speaking to you about it, trying to communicate to those who will listen, including the politicians, who are often, who am I, right? So, if I send them an email, it just goes into the, spam, and, it's disappointing that I don't get more feedback from them. And I understand they've got a lot going on in difficult jobs. But fundamentally, you ask what I do, it's the young mining professionals, which I spend an awful lot of time over the past, 10 plus years. I've dedicated many, many hours and come up with good ideas, recruited with and worked with amazing people who all share the same goals. It's been a fun thing, which is, especially when it's all volunteers, they're all volunteers. It has to be fun. So we do have fun, and we are positive, and we recognize and respect everybody's time, but we all do share, I guess, a passion for the industry, and we give back in so many ways. It's like, maybe one day I'll look back and think about, how impactful young mining professionals could be or was, because just through the connections of people. I mean, I think that, aside from the scholarships, which is something I'm eminently proud of and is a lot of work, trust me, just the stuff that we don't do a lot of work on, like we hosted dinner. We had Paul Rollinson from Kinross a couple weeks ago, the CEO of Kinross, wonderful guy, wonderful story. And maybe there was two young mining professionals that came that night that met, and they wouldn't have otherwise met, but then they met and they become business partners, and they share an idea and they create the next Kinross or Barrick or whatnot. So I think call it the wishful thinking externalities that are almost certainly have occurred as a result of the young mining professionals works, because we are global. We host, 6 events a year. We have thousands and thousands of people and tens of thousands of interactions. There's going to be some good that comes out of it. So look, I don't solve all the problems. Even if I could, I'd be focused elsewhere, because again, my priority is my family, my priority is my business, and in my spare time, I do what I can to advance the young mining professionals' interests and the interest of the industry at large. But there's only so much I can do.
Yeah. I don't know what I was expecting, actually. I maybe thought you'd say you'd dress up in plaid and maple leaves as a mask and then go out as a superhero to fight crimes on the markets. That's how I imagine a Canadian superhero would look like. But
Well, you are one axe away from looking like a lumberjack, Antonio,
I'm
with your
trying my very
sweater
best.
there and your beard and everything. I saw a video. You had a Tilly hat on.
I
Geez,
too.
you're almost Canadian.
I'm trying my very best, although I'm still failing, but maybe that'll come. This has been a good introduction to how to save Canadian mining. I think it's going to warrant a follow up. I know there's going to be a reaction to this for people listening as well. If we're forgetting something, if we're getting something wrong, let your voice be heard in the comments, and let us know what we're missing. We'll discuss that in a future episode. But for now, Stephen, I think I'm out of questions. What am I forgetting here? Anything else you want to add here at the end?
No, look, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience and distribute my message. I'm speaking my book. I'm also speaking my interest in the industry. Hopefully, I didn't say anything to get me in too much trouble, but I always appreciate your time, Antonio.
And as always, thanks to everyone for watching Resource Talks. I have a couple of more things to say, though. The fact that this company was interviewed here today does not mean that they're necessarily a good or a bad company. I'm not here to endorse nor attack anyone. I am simply here to ask some questions. If you find that I have failed in asking a question that you would have liked to hear an answer to, which will happen as I'm not an experienced interviewer, please let me know, and I will try to correct that mistake in a future interview. As mentioned at the beginning, please understand that mineral exploration and development is an extremely risky business. Losing money is the norm and should be the expectation. This is a very complex sector, and the performance of individual companies typically depends on many different moving particles, including company-specific factors like geology, financing ability, and many others, really, as well as particles that are outside of the company's control, like geopolitics, macroeconomics, commodity prices, and many more, most of which are nearly impossible to fully understand. Moreover, these companies that typically get interviewed on Resource Talks are in the pre-revenue stage, which means they rely on the public markets for the financing of their operations, which could result in shareholder dilution. Furthermore, as a general rule of thumb, you'll be better off understanding that all company communications online, albeit this interview or their website and their presentation and their social media accounts, or even the social media accounts which you thought were your friends and then told you about a stock, everything really that these companies do is intended as marketing. And although I do not make buy or sell recommendations because there is a clear conflict of interest given the nature of my business, many out there do. And you should be aware of that inherent bias, and you should be careful out there. That bias is not always going to be clearly disclosed with everyone out there. So it is safer for you anytime you're watching any type of company specific content to approach it with a dose of skepticism and assume that the party telling you about it is biased in at least some shape or form, because there will always be a bias. Again, albeit clear or not. So always ask yourself what the incentive of your counterparty is and never rely on them regardless of their incentives, but instead double check if what they're saying is true, again, by using setterplus.ca. The fact that I have no idea what I'm doing should already be clear to you at this point. I am not saying this to make jokes or laugh with myself. I just simply do not have a long enough track record of consistent investment profits. So I should, under no circumstances, be considered an authority on anything. Again, although this may sound amusing to you, believe me, it is not amusing, and it is not intended as a joke. I'm simply pointing out a fact and warning you not to rely on anything I do or say. Unfortunately, at least to my understanding, nobody out there has any special abilities. The CEOs do not possess any superior knowledge, and they cannot know about what will go up, what will go down, or what will go in circles. Some people even believe that to be rule number one on Wall Street. Nobody really knows. None of us know whether any of the company's activities will result in a success, again, given that we're talking about high-risk activities where most of the times it ends in failure. Oh, so unfortunately, try as I may, I won't always catch all red flags or all challenges with the companies. So even if I did ask a few tough questions in here, don't rely on this being all of the tough questions. Again, these are complicated startups with many moving parts, and I am conflicted given the nature of this business. Therefore, I cannot guarantee the quality of anything presented in this video, and you cannot hold me responsible for any losses or damages stemming from the way you decide to use this interview. Viewers, listeners, and readers acknowledge and agree that the information presented herein did not constitute a solicitation or an offer to buy or sell any security or investment or to participate in any trading strategy. Resource Talks and all parties involved in the management of the business strictly disclaim any and all liability for losses and or damages, whether direct, indirect, special, or consequential, or other consequences, however so caused, arising out of any use or reproduction of the content published by Resource Talks, or any decision made or action taken in reliance upon it. By consuming this content, all consumers vow to release Resource Talks and all parties involved in the management of the business from all claims, proceedings, or consequences. This is all to say, I know it's a lot of lawyer talk, but this is all to say that you shouldn't blindly trust me or anybody on the internet, and you should do your own research. Once again, Social media is meant for entertainment. It is setterplus.ca where you do your research. That's where you'll find a company's official filings, and I encourage you to read and analyze the management information circular, the financial statements, the management discussion and analysis, and whenever available, the NI 43-101 technical documents. If you don't understand everything in those documents, the chances of you losing money are even higher than they normally are in this space. And as mentioned earlier, the chances of even the best analysts in this sector losing money are extremely high, since this is venture capital and it is not for everybody. I'll leave you with one of Charlie Munger's quotes, which I wish I had listened to more often earlier on, which says, quote, "If you don't understand it, don't do it."